Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking quite a critical mission, actually, cracking open one of the most cited yet, well, potentially most misunderstood documents in 20th century Catholic history, Pope Pius XII, 1950 encyclical Humani Generis.
Yeah, it's one you hear about a lot. For decades, you've probably heard the conventional wisdom that Humani Generis, or HG as we might call it, served as the Catholic Church's Magna Carta for evolution.
Right, that it sort of opened the door.
Exactly. It's often presented as the document that gave Catholic thinkers the necessary freedom, the green light, to reconcile their faith with modern macroevolutionary theory.
But our deep dive today is going to challenge that narrative head-on. We're going to test that popular interpretation against a complete, consistent reading of the text itself, based on the analytical sources provided by theologian and physicist Afar Victor Warkulwiz. And the core claim here is pretty shocking. This widely held view that Pius XII okayed evolution might be fundamentally false.
Precisely. Our mission today is to show that, based on this analysis, Pius XII was no friend of evolution. Actually, he saw immense danger in the whole proposition and imposed really severe, often ignored, restrictions on even discussing it.
So, not a green light at all.
Not according to this reading, no. To understand this, you can't just cherry-pick one paragraph. We have to understand the document as, well, a comprehensive defense of constant church teaching regarding Genesis as literal, true history, and really a wholesale assault on the philosophical underpinnings of universal evolution.
Okay, wow, that sounds like a complete historical reversal for a lot of people listening. So, before we even get into the philosophical meat of Humani Generis, we absolutely have to address the immediate counter-argument that listeners will surely raise. Pope John Paul II's 1996 address. The one to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, where he famously stated that evolution was more than a hypothesis. Didn't that kind of settle the matter, at least in the Church's view, a generation later?
That's a crucial starting point, yeah. And it's the question everyone asks. But according to the consistent reading demanded by our sources, no, it didn't settle the matter from a binding doctrinal standpoint. Warkulwiz emphasizes that John Paul II framed that address explicitly as a dialogue with science.
A dialogue, not a decree.
Exactly. It was meant to foster mutual understanding, find common ground, not to function as a binding doctrinal development or, a mandate for Catholics to suddenly adopt the theory wholesale.
And that distinction between dialogue and dogma is really key here, isn't it?
Absolutely. The sources stress a critical point regarding papal authority. Since the Pope's reflection concerned natural science, the mechanisms of the physical world, it falls outside the defined range of his infallible authority concerning faith and morals.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't playing in the faith and morals sandbox, so to speak.
Right. Therefore, it can't be interpreted as a development of binding dogma. And furthermore, even giving some credibility to a scientific theory doesn't automatically negate the initial, much deeper theological and philosophical objections that Pius XII had raised decades earlier.
Okay, let's drill down on that deeper objection then, because this is where the subtlety, maybe the forgotten subtlety of Humani Generis comes in. It's not just about arguing over scientific mechanisms, is it? It's about the spirit, the underlying philosophy of the theory itself. Even if you try to bring God into the picture, theistic evolution, why does the source material still claim that the theory retains this inherent underlying harmfulness?
The harmfulness, as Pius XII apparently understood it, is rooted in the, let's call it the atheistic spirit in which the theory was first conceived and, crucially, how it was propagated. Evolution, especially in its Darwinian and later forms, offers a supposedly self-contained, purely naturalistic explanation for the origin of everything.
Without needing God anywhere.
Precisely. It provides a complete account that simply leaves the creator out of the equation. And the source argues that even if a Catholic believer tries to overlay God onto that structure, saying, oh, well, God guided the mutations, they are still fundamentally relying on a framework that was built by philosophical naturalists specifically to exclude God.
So the engine is still godless, even if you paint a cross on the hood.
That's the way to put it, yeah. Atheists, the sources note, remain perfectly comfortable with theistic evolution because the underlying mechanism remains self-consistent without God. Injecting God becomes, well, almost a superfluous theological add-on. It doesn't really restore the essential concept of creation ex nihilo and ongoing divine providence.
And this leads directly to
the loss of confidence in sacred scripture. I mean, if Genesis is fundamentally wrong about how things came to be, why should you trust it on morality or redemption or anything else? That erosion of confidence in the Bible's truthfulness is the real mechanism of harm identified here.
Okay, let's pivot to the historical and philosophical landscape. Pius XII was actually facing back in 1950. He subtitled Humani Generis, Some False Opinions Which Threaten to Undermine Catholic Doctrine. When he used language that strong, what was the principle, the overarching threat he was most concerned about?
The big one was modernism. And to really grasp the gravity of this, we have to rewind a bit, back to 1907 and Pope St. Pius X's encyclical, Pascendi. St. Pius X didn't mince words. He called modernism the worst heresy in the entire history of Christianity.
Wow, the worst heresy ever. I mean, that's breathtakingly strong language, isn't it? Especially considering the church had fought things like Arianism, Nestorianism, the huge challenges of the Reformation. Why was modernism singled out with such, well, unique vehemence?
Because St. Pius X argued that previous heresies were, you could say, tactical. They distorted some specific doctrines, like, say, the nature of Christ or the role of grace, but they generally left the foundational principles of objective truth and dogmatic stability kind of intact.
Yeah.
Modernism, however, was seen as strategic, aiming at the foundations.
Mm-hmm.
And St. Pius X identified its principal doctrine, the engine driving it, as universal evolution.
Meaning evolution wasn't just a biological theory for them, it was a philosophical framework for absolutely everything.
Exactly. If you accept the core modernist premise that everything evolves, nothing is fixed, and nothing is permanent, it threatens to destroy the very idea of immutable truth. If reality itself is constantly adapting and changing, then the church, logically, must constantly adapt its liturgy, its moral laws, its dogmas, even its structure, to fit the new, supposedly evolved stage of humanity.
A church constantly chasing the zeitgeist.
Precisely. And St. Pius X saw this as leading inevitably to the total destruction of the faith, because there would be no permanent objective standard left to hold on to or defend. Everything becomes relative to the current stage of evolution.
So that leap from a specific scientific theory to a universal philosophical principle, that's the real source of danger Pius XII was picking up on from Pius X. How does he confront this concept of universal evolution directly in Humani Generis?
He tackles it head-on in paragraph 5. He critiques those who, quote, imprudently and indiscreetly hold that evolution, which has not been fully proved even in the domain of natural sciences, explains the origin of all things. And then he identifies the ultimate philosophical pitfall they fall into. They audaciously support the monistic and pantheistic opinion that the world is in continual evolution.
Okay, let's quickly define those terms for anyone listening. Monistic and pantheistic.
Sure. Monism is basically the belief that reality is fundamentally just one single substance or principle. And pantheism is the belief that God is everything and everything is God. So when you tie those ideas to continual evolution, you end up with this picture of the world as a single, divine, self-developing entity.
Which erases the line between God and the world.
Exactly. It eliminates the crucial distinction between the creator and the created. And it gets rid of the need for a transcendent personal God who acts on the world from outside the system. God just becomes the process itself.
And Pius XII immediately connects this scientific and philosophical viewpoint to political consequences, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He points out that communists gladly subscribe to this opinion of continuous universal evolution because it perfectly serves dialectical materialism. If you accept universal evolution, you kind of deprive people of the idea of a personal God who established fixed laws and duties.
Making them more receptive to a purely materialist worldview.
Right. It aids in propagating a worldview where political and moral reality are also seen as being in constant flux, subject only to historical and economic forces, not to any divine or natural law.
This scientific naturalism, though, it didn't just appear out of nowhere in 1950. It required a huge shift in how people even thought about time, geological time especially.
Yeah.
This takes us back to the 18th and 19th centuries. The sources trace this, this evolution of ideas, ironically.
That's right. The intellectual groundwork was laid much, much earlier. Our source material points back to Laplace's nebular hypothesis in the 18th century, suggesting a natural process for solar system formation, which is seen as sort of the great-granddaddy of the modern Big Bang theory. Then you had biological theories like Lamarck's, which were mostly rejected later. But the really crucial stepping stone, the thing that provided the necessary philosophical lubricant for Darwin, was Charles Lyell.
Lyell's work on geology, Principles of Geology, back in 1830, why was that book so absolutely vital for the whole evolutionary project?
Lyell gave Darwin the essential currency he needed: immense, almost limitless time. His theory, known as uniformitarianism, asserted that the geological processes we see happening today, erosion, sedimentation, volcanoes, have always operated at the same slow, gradual rates over millions and millions of years.
The present is the key to the past.
That's the slogan. And this idea fundamentally rejected the biblical chronology, which spoke of thousands of years. But most importantly, it implicitly, and later explicitly, rejected the historicity of the worldwide Great Flood described in Genesis.
So wait, without Lyell first getting rid of the flood as a major geological event and stretching time from thousands of years to millions or billions, Darwin's theory of slow biological adaptation over vast periods couldn't even get off the ground, could it? Geology had to clear the path for biology.
Precisely. If the Earth was only, say, 6,000 or 10,000 years old, as a straightforward reading of biblical chronology might suggest, then the mechanism of natural selection needing countless tiny changes over innumerable generations simply doesn't work. It doesn't have enough time. So the denial of Genesis, particularly the flood and the timescale, was almost a scientific prerequisite before Darwin even published on the origin of species in 1859.
That's fascinating. The philosophical groundwork had to be laid first.
Yes, and the sources also note that even the biological evidence for Darwinism itself is often presented as stronger than it is. His theory really requires finding countless transitional forms in the fossil record, right? But those intermediate forms are consistently, stubbornly absent, even today under modern neo-Darwinian frameworks. Yet despite this perceived lack of slam-dunk proof, the idea of continual evolution was elevated into this overarching metaphysical principle. Which brings us right back to Pius XII's core philosophical fight in paragraph 6 of the encyclical.
Okay, let's dive into that philosophical chain reaction he saw. Darwinian biological flux leading to nominalism in philosophy, and then that nominalism ultimately leading to existentialism. How does denying fixed biological kinds lead to rejecting stable, unchanging essences in philosophy?
Well, if you accept continuous universal evolution as the fundamental reality, then living organisms are always in a state of becoming, always in flux. They never actually stay the same long enough to possess a truly stable, specific nature or essence.
So the biblical idea that God created things according to its kind, that's at the window.
That's rejected, yes. That idea implies a fixed template, a stable design. But evolution suggests there are no fixed templates, only shifting populations. Now, the whole structure of classical philosophy, going right back to Aristotle and Aquinas, depends on things having a stable wetness, an essence. That's how we understand and categorize the world.
And rejecting that stable wetness is what philosophers call nominalism.
Correct. Nominalism comes from the Latin word nomen, meaning name. It's the view that there are no real universal essences or shared natures out there in the world. There are only individual, unique, transient things. The names we assign to groups of them, like dog or man, are just convenient labels, helpful fictions maybe, but they don't reflect any objective, underlying shared reality or nature.
So dogness isn't real, only individual dogs are.
Basically, yes. And this is why, as the source points out, evolutionary biology still struggles so fundamentally to come up with a universally agreed-upon definition of species. A species definition really requires some level of permanence and stability, which the core theory of constant flux denies. Species names, from a strict evolutionary nominalist view, become almost like proper names for historically unique, transient lineages, not categories based on a shared essence.
Okay, I see the link to biology. Now, how does generalizing that nominalism, moving it from just biological species to humanity itself, lead to the erroneous philosophy of existentialism that Pius XII condemns?
Well, the philosophical generalization is potentially devastating from a traditional viewpoint. If all that truly exists and matters is individual, transient existence, and the idea of a stable, shared human nature is neglected or denied, you arrive pretty quickly at existentialism. Pius XII critiques this philosophy precisely because he says it concerns itself only with the existence of individual things and neglects all consideration of their immutable essences.
And if humans lack an immutable essence, a fixed nature, what does that strip away from human life?
It basically saps human life of all inherent meaning and purpose that would derive from a divinely appointed nature. Classical and Christian philosophy posits that man has a fixed, rational nature given by God. This nature dictates certain duties, it's the foundation for objective moral laws, and it points towards specific ends or purposes, what philosophers call teleology.
But if man is just an accident?
If man is simply a transient phenomenon, an accidental result of a blind evolution-generated history, then he's just an individual with a name, maybe, but without a permanent, objective nature or purpose inherent in his being. The traditional moral compass, grounded in that nature, gets lost. This is the intellectual lineage Pius XII was fighting against, a scientific theory he saw morphing into a philosophical poison that dissolved meaning and morality.
Now, in the mid-20th century, this kind of evolutionary philosophy had a specific, incredibly influential face within Catholicism itself, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. We really can't discuss this period without mentioning him, can we?
No, absolutely not. Teilhard de Chardin, who was both a Jesuit priest and a paleontologist, became arguably the most prominent Catholic evolutionist of the era, and maybe ever. His work, particularly his book The Phenomenon of Man, was this grand synthesis. It attempted to merge the spiritual narrative of Catholicism with a highly sophisticated, but also quite dogmatic version of theistic evolution.
And he wasn't just cautiously accepting some biological transformation. He seemed to elevate evolution to the status of ultimate truth itself. That sounds miles away from the restrictive sandbox Pius XII apparently wanted.
I was far, far beyond caution. The source provides a really revealing quote that illustrates Teilhard's almost dogmatic certainty about evolution. He wrote, "Is evolution a theory, a system, or a hypothesis? It is much more. It is a general condition to which all theories must bow and which they must satisfy. Evolution is a light illuminating all facts, a curve that all lines must follow."
Wow. So in his view, evolution defines truth. It's not just a truth, it's the light.
That's how it reads. For him, evolution wasn't really a question to be debated or discussed with restrictions. It was the ultimate interpretive key, the light by which all of reality, including faith, must be measured and understood.
How did the Holy Office, which was the Church's main doctrinal watchdog back then, now the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, how did they respond to Teilhard's widespread influence?
They reacted with significant alarm, actually. In 1957, the Holy Office ordered his published works, and even unpublished manuscripts, removed from all Catholic institutional libraries, seminaries, universities, and so on. That was a pretty clear signal of the danger they perceived.
A strong move.
Very. Then, a few years later, in 1962, they issued a formal warning, known as a monism. This specifically cautioned the faithful about the errors and ambiguities present in Teilhard's writings and those of his followers. This official censure shows that the Catholic hierarchy, even years after Humani Generis was issued, continued to view this enthusiastic universalist evolutionism as a serious threat to foundational Catholic ideas about creation, original sin, grace, and the nature of God.
So the context wasn't one of growing acceptance, but ongoing concern at the highest levels.
According to this interpretation, yes. The concern was deep and persistent.
Okay, moving from the philosophical backdrop to the direct theological battleground. Pius XII next tackles the assault on the sacred history contained in Genesis, chapters 1 through 11. This history was in direct conflict with the new evolutionary and, as we discussed, uniformitarian geological models.
Yes, and this section of Humani Generis is critical because it strongly upholds what the source argues is the consistent traditional view of the Church. The sources argue very adamantly that all the Church Fathers and the doctors of the Church for nearly 2,000 years read Genesis 1:11 as literal, true history.
Not as myth or allegory?
Not primarily, no. They might see allegorical layers, but the foundation was historical truth. Any claim you hear today from modern academics suggesting the Fathers didn't read it historically, for example, the source mentions someone like Kenneth Miller making such claims is characterized by our source as a profound and serious misrepresentation of historical theology.
And St. Augustine, who is arguably the most towering intellectual figure among the Latin Fathers, addressed this very specifically, didn't he? In his work, The Literal Interpretation of Genesis.
He certainly did. Augustine explicitly affirmed that the Genesis narrative is not written in a style proper to allegory, as in the Canticle of Canticles, the Song of Songs, but from beginning to end in a style proper to history, as in the books of Chronicles.
So he saw it as historical writing, like Kings or Chronicles.
Exactly. Augustine had no doubt about its historical intent. The source really emphasizes this point. The Fathers believed in the literal historical truth of the events described in that sacred history, including the creation taking place in 6 days and the actual historical existence of Adam and Eve as the first parents.
This traditional view brings us to the sharp criticism found in paragraph 23 of Humani Generis, where Pius XII targets what was being called the new exegesis. What exactly was this new method, which its proponents claimed would finally, unlock the Old Testament?
They called it symbolic or spiritual exegesis. The claim was essentially that by moving away from the supposedly outdated or naive literal meaning, all the difficulties, meaning primarily all the conflicts with modern science, would instantly vanish. This new symbolic reading, they argued, would throw open the Old Testament, which they saw as a previously sealed book.
And Pius XII wasn't buying it.
Not at all. He found this claim deeply offensive, actually labeling it an elitist notion.
Elitist. That's quite a charge. What was the implicit arrogance that Pius XII saw in this approach?
The arrogance, as he saw it, lies in the implication that for 2 entire millennia, the whole body of the church, including the great church fathers, the doctors, the popes, countless saints, and the general faithful, had fundamentally failed to correctly understand sacred scripture.
As if they were all missing the real meaning.
Right. And that only now, armed with modern perspectives, often influenced by what Pius XII elsewhere calls false science, could a small group of contemporary scholars finally set things straight. The source goes further, calling the logical conclusion of this idea blasphemous, because it implicitly suggests that God, the primary author of Scripture, wrote a story that actively deceived generations upon generations of believers for centuries.
Only to be correctly deciphered in the modern era.
Exactly. Deciphered by modern scholars who were, in Pius XII's view, potentially compromised by the very philosophical errors he was condemning.
We should probably pause here to clarify a really common misunderstanding. When we talk about upholding the literal historical truth of Genesis, that doesn't mean denying any figurative language is used, does it?
No, absolutely not. And this is a vital distinction. Literal historical truth simply means that the truth of the events is expressed plainly, whether that's in strictly literal terms or through figurative language that is contextually clear and understandable.
Can you give an example?
Sure. When Genesis says God walked in the garden, or speaks of God's strong hand, traditional interpretation understands these as anthropomorphisms, applying human characteristics to God to convey a truth about his presence or power. It's a figure of speech, but its meaning is clear in context. It helps reveal truth. It doesn't hide it in code. We use metaphors and figures of speech constantly in modern English too, right?
Of course.
So what Pius XII was condemning wasn't figurative language per se. It was the idea of cryptic symbolism, a system where the plain text means something completely different, something hidden, that requires a special, modern, often science-influenced key to unlock. He was defending the plain sense, whether literal or clearly figurative.
Okay. And to defend that plain reading of Genesis, Pius XII explicitly points back to the established norms for biblical interpretation, particularly those laid down by Pope Leo III decades earlier.
Yes, in paragraph 24, he explicitly reaffirms the interpretive norms set forth in Leo XIII's 1893 encyclical Providentissimus Deus, and also Benedict XII's Spiritus Paraclitus from 1920. The foundational rule, which Leo XIII himself derived directly from St. Augustine, is treated as almost sacrosanct. You should not depart from the literal and obvious sense of Scripture.
Unless.
Except only where reason makes it untenable or necessity requires.
So the bar for abandoning the historical reading is set incredibly high. You need a truly compelling, inescapable reason, a genuine necessity to do so.
Exactly. And the entire thesis of our source material on this point is that the alleged conflicts between Genesis and modern science, primarily coming from uniformitarian geology and macroevolution, do not meet that high standard of necessity.
Why not? Because the science itself is questionable.
Partly. The source argues that these scientific paradigms are often built upon unproven philosophical assumptions, like strict naturalism, rather than being pure, unadulterated fact. Yeah. Because they are based on these contestable philosophical grounds, they don't provide the untenable reason or the necessity that Augustine and Leo X required to overturn the plain historical sense of the text.
Yeah.
Therefore, the argument goes, the traditional historical reading of Genesis 1:11 must stand.
And if you stand by the historicity of Genesis 1 through 11, that implicitly upholds the historicity of the Great Flood narrative in Genesis 6 through 9, which takes us right back to Lyell and geology.
It absolutely confirms that fundamental conflict. If you accept the historicity of the flood account in Genesis 6 through 9, then you accept a global catastrophic event that would have radically shaped the Earth's geology and laid down the fossil record in a very different way than Lyell proposed.
So the source argues the flood explains the fossils better.
Yes. Our sources argue quite forcefully that a global flood provides a far better, more coherent, and more scientifically consistent explanation for the vast sedimentary layers we see worldwide and for the specific ordering and burial of fossils within them than the slow, gradual, uniformitarian processes popularized by Lyell and absolutely necessary for Darwinism to work. So by upholding the literal historical truth of Genesis, Pius XII was, perhaps implicitly, but definitely consequentially, challenging the entire geological foundation upon which macroevolution had been built.
Okay, this brings us to the absolute lightning rod of the entire encyclical, paragraph 36. If I were to, survey 100 academics or theologians today, probably 99 would point straight to this paragraph as the moment the Catholic Church effectively conceded on evolution. But if we apply the rigorous consistency test demanded by our sources, what does Pius XII actually permit in this paragraph? And crucially, how is that permission hemmed in by restrictions?
Right, this is the single most misinterpreted passage, according to this analysis. It is permission for research and discussion, yes, but it's permission that is intensely, almost suffocatingly restricted. It is emphatically not permission to simply believe in or accept evolution as a proven fact. Warkulwiz, in his analysis, identifies four critical restraints that effectively turn this supposed Magna Carta into more of a tightly controlled scholarly sandbox, complete with very clear boundaries and tripwires.
Okay, let's break those down. Restriction number one, the scope. What exactly are they even allowed to discuss?
The permission is granted only, quote, in as far as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. Now, pause right there and notice what is specifically not mentioned.
The origin of that pre-existent and living matter itself.
Exactly. The source contends that Pius XII had to be assuming that the origin of that first life, the pre-existent and living matter, must conform to the Genesis account of creation by fixed kinds. He simply could not allow the full scope of Darwinian evolution, which contradicts Genesis chapter 1 wholesale, by proposing a naturalistic origin of all life from non-life, followed by universal common descent. So, the permission is narrowly limited strictly to the very final stages, the potential transformation of some pre-existing living thing into a human body.
Okay, restriction two, the participants. Who is even qualified, according to Pius XII, to have this limited discussion?
It's restricted again. Discussion is only allowed on the part of men experienced in both fields, meaning they have to be experts in the relevant natural sciences and in theology or philosophy.
Not just one or the other.
Correct. This immediately excludes, say, arbitrary assertions of fact by scientists who are ignorant of theological implications, and it also excludes theologians who might be pontificating without a solid grasp of the actual scientific evidence, or lack thereof. It demands a sophisticated, genuinely interdisciplinary approach, not just blindly adopting the current scientific consensus.
Makes sense. Restriction number three concerns the method of the discussion. How should they go about it?
It must be balanced and critical. Participants are required to weigh and judge reasons both favorable and those unfavorable to evolution with, quote, necessary seriousness, moderation, and measure.
So not just cheerleading for evolution.
Definitely not. This is not permission to simply adopt evolution and try to fit theology around it. It's an explicit mandate to critically examine the evidence against it just as seriously, just as rigorously as the evidence presented for it. The very idea that macroevolution is settled science, which you hear all the time, is explicitly rejected by this requirement for ongoing, balanced critical scrutiny.
Okay, and the fourth, final, and perhaps most crucial restriction, the one regarding authority.
The ultimate authority rests with the Church. All participants in this discussion, whatever their findings or opinions, must be prepared to submit to the judgment of the Church, which Pius XII reminds them is the authentic interpreter of sacred scripture and the defender of defined dogmas.
So the Church gets the final say, no matter what the scientists or theologians conclude among themselves.
Precisely. And then, immediately after laying out these restrictions, within the very same paragraph 36, Pius XII issues a sharp warning. He castigates those who, quote, rashly transgress this liberty of discussion by acting as if the origin of the human body from pre-existing matter is already completely certain and proved by the facts, thereby neglecting the caution demanded by divine revelation.
That sounds like a direct rebuke to some people at the time.
It reads exactly like a severe reprimand, aimed squarely at the more enthusiastic evolutionists, perhaps like the followers of Teilhard de Chardin, who are presenting evolution as a done deal.
So yeah, putting it all together, it sounds less like permission to proceed with belief in evolution and much more like an extremely high bar, a set of conditions that most modern evolutionary narratives would likely fail to clear, especially regarding the need for critical balance and submission to church judgment.
That's the argument, yes. It's framed as caution, not concession.
And even if someone tries to operate within those four restrictions, the sources highlight profound philosophical and theological roadblocks that make reconciling any form of human evolution with classical Catholic theology incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Let's start with the absolute bedrock, the soul.
Right, that's a non-negotiable foundation. Catholic faith obliges every believer to hold that individual human souls are immediately created by God at the moment. He determines they don't evolve, they aren't inherited from parents.
Okay, immediate creation of the soul. How does that impact the body?
Well, it requires that the living matter, the physical body, must be perfectly prepared, suitably organized, to receive that rational human soul from God. The process by which this bodily preparation might hypothetically occur from pre-existing living matter is sometimes called transformism.
And the sources break transformism down into two possible types, right? One of which was apparently ruled out quite early on.
That's correct. The first type is natural transformism. This would be the idea that purely natural, unguided, continuous evolutionary processes prepare the brute matter, say the body of an advanced hominid, until it reaches a point where it's suitable for God to infuse a human soul.
And that was rejected.
Yes, according to the source, this view was ruled out by the Provincial Council of Cologne back in 1860 in a decree that was later approved by the Holy See in Rome. They declared that such an idea that the human body could arise through purely natural processes without special divine intervention is contrary to sacred scripture and the faith.
Okay, so natural transformism is off the table, according to that council. That leaves the other option. Special transformism. What's that?
Special transformism is the hypothesis that God directly intervenes in the process. He takes pre-existing living matter, again, maybe the body of a highly evolved brute, and then supernaturally transforms or prepares it specifically to receive the human soul he intends to create.
So God gets involved directly in preparing the body. Why does even that process create philosophical difficulties, even under the most accommodating reading of Catholic thought?
There are several major problems highlighted. First, from a philosophical standpoint, special transformism actually excludes naturalistic evolution. Think about it. Evolutionists insist that natural processes, operating without direct divine intervention, are what drive change. Special transformism, by definition, insists God must directly intervene and manipulate the matter. The two are fundamentally different processes.
So it's not really evolution in the scientific sense anymore.
Not in the purely naturalistic sense, no. Second, as theologians like Cardinal Ernest Ruffini pointed out back in the 1940s and 50s, special transformism seems arguably, no, superfluous or unnecessarily complex. If God has to intervene directly and miraculously transform the brute matter anyway to make it ready for a human soul, why wouldn't he just create Adam's body directly from the dust of the earth, as Genesis literally states? Why the complicated intermediate step involving a pre-existing creature? It seems like an added complexity with no clear benefit.
Like adding an extra unnecessary miracle.
Kind of, yeah. But the third point is perhaps the most theologically devastating and revolves around the problem of dualism. The traditional Catholic understanding of the human person requires a deep, holistic unity between body and soul.
Right, you mentioned this earlier, not two separate things glued together.
Exactly. This is the crux of the issue. The traditional Catholic view, strongly affirmed by the Catechism today in Article 365, which explicitly cites Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, is holistic. It holds that the human soul is the substantial form of the body. Spirit and matter together form a single, unified nature. There are not two independent substances, like Descartes' idea of the ghost in the machine.
Okay, so how would special transformism risk falling into that dualistic trap?
The danger arises if you imagine taking a body that already fully exists as a living entity, say a brute hominid body, which, according to Aristotelian Thomistic thought, would already possess its own sensitive or brute soul, and then you somehow remove that brute soul and inject or infuse a rational human soul in its place.
Replacing one soul with another in the same body?
Yes. If you do that, you are effectively treating the body and the soul as two independent, complete substances that just happen to occupy the same physical space for a time. You break that fundamental unity of nature that Thomism insists upon. You imply the body was already a complete living thing before the human soul arrived, making the soul seem like an addition rather than the very principle that makes the body what it is.
So how is this dualism avoided in the traditional account?
The argument presented is that the only way to truly avoid this dualistic error, the only way to maintain the robust Thomistic view of man as a single unified nature, is through the simultaneous creation of Adam's body and soul by God. St. Thomas Aquinas himself argued that it would be inconsistent with the perfection of the production of things for God to have made Adam's body without its rational soul, or the soul without its corresponding body. The creation of the first man, like the ensoulment of every subsequent human being at conception, must be an instantaneous event where matter is organized by the soul coming into existence.
Which makes any gradual evolutionary preparation of the body philosophically suspect from this Thomistic perspective.
Fundamentally suspect, yes. It challenges the very anthropology.
And there's one more major complication often raised in this context: the special creation of Eve.
Absolutely. This adds another layer of difficulty. Magisterial teaching, echoed strongly in the Catechism, Article 375, consistently affirms the special creation of Eve from Adam's side, as described in Genesis 2. Cardinal Ruffini again emphasized this point. If you were to allow that Adam evolved through lengthy, gradual, natural, or even specially guided processes, but then Eve was created instantaneously through a direct, special divine act from Adam's side.
You'd have a huge difference in their origins.
Exactly. You would introduce what Ruffini called an unthinkable disparity in dignity between the first man and the first woman based solely on their mode of origin. Since the Church cannot accept such a fundamental disparity in dignity between them, this theological fact strongly reinforces the case against any form of evolutionary origin for Adam himself. If Eve was specially created, consistency seems to demand Adam was too.
Wow. So layer upon layer of restriction and difficulty.
That's the picture painted by this analysis of Humani Generis and its theological context, yes.
Now, if paragraph 36 was a complex maze of restrictions and warnings, the very next paragraph, paragraph 37, seems like a simple, straightforward, non-negotiable brick wall. Here, Pius XII is completely unambiguous on the issue of Polygenism.
Yes, this is the immovable pillar in the document, the point where any perceived flexibility just vanishes. Pius XII states with absolute clarity that the faithful by no means enjoy such liberty when it comes to the opinion of Polygenism.
And Polygenism is
It's the idea that true human beings existed on Earth who did not descend biologically from one single individual man named Adam. Or, alternatively, that the name Adam in Scripture represents not an individual but a whole group of multiple first parents who originated the human race simultaneously or in different places.
And the reason for this absolute unyielding doctrinal ban is purely theological, isn't it? It's tied intrinsically to the doctrine of original sin.
That's precisely correct. Polygenism is banned because, as Pius XII states, it simply cannot be reconciled with the Church's defined doctrine of original sin. That doctrine dogmatically requires that the inherited state of sinfulness affecting all humanity proceeded from a real historical sin actually committed by one individual Adam.
Not a group sin or a mythical fall.
Right, an actual sin by an individual. And that this state of sin, this guilt, is passed on to all subsequent human beings through generation, meaning through biological descent from that one individual. If there were multiple starting groups of humans who didn't descend from Adam, Polygenism, then this whole mechanism of universally inherited sin from a single specific source completely falls apart. The link between the dogma of original sin and monogenism, descent from one Adam, is seen as intimate and utterly unbreakable.
This ban, though, creates what seems like an impossible paradox for any consistent naturalistic evolutionist who also wants to be a faithful Catholic.
It really does create a fatal contradiction for them. You see, naturalistic evolution, as understood by science, absolutely requires that significant evolutionary changes occur gradually over long periods within populations of organisms, not just in one isolated individual. Change spreads through differential reproduction, genetic drift, mutations occurring across a whole gene pool, spread across potentially vast geographies and timeframes.
Evolution happens to groups, not single beings.
Generally, yes, especially for macro-level changes leading to new species. So for evolution to produce the human species in a way that respects the Church's absolute ban on polygenism, it would have to have occurred miraculously in one single person only, Adam, who then became the sole biological progenitor of the entire human race, with Eve somehow also originating from him alone.
Which, from a standard evolutionary science perspective, is completely absurd, isn't it?
Utterly unthinkable, yes. For a consistent biologist committed to naturalistic mechanisms, accepting that a massive, one-time macroevolutionary leave happened instantaneously in a single, isolated individual atom is just as scientifically problematic, just as miraculous and non-naturalistic, as accepting the traditional account of the instantaneous special creation of Adam from inanimate dust. Either way, you are forced to admit a unique, non-repeatable, supernatural-style event that completely destroys the entire scientific premise of gradual, natural, population-based change.
So the ban on polygenism acts as a kind of theological kill switch for any attempt to smoothly integrate standard evolutionary theory with Catholic doctrine on human origins.
That's exactly how the source presents it. It's a theological barrier that standard naturalistic evolution simply cannot cross while remaining consistent with itself and with church teaching.
And the status of this ban on polygenism has remained firm since 1950, hasn't it? It was explicitly reaffirmed by Pope Paul VI in a speech in 1966. And the source argues that even if Pius XII didn't define it using the formal language of ex cathedra infallibility, it should still be treated effectively as infallible teaching.
Yes, the argument is that it should be considered infallible by virtue of its intimate and unbreakable connection with infallible teaching on original sin. Pius XII wasn't inviting theologians to discuss whether Polygenism conflicts with dogma. He authoritatively stated that it does conflict. The source argues it's actually quite dangerous for theologians today to treat this as if it's still an open question, suggesting that many modern theologians are perhaps timorous about pseudoscientific doctrine, afraid to challenge scientific consensus, while simultaneously being temerarious about Catholic doctrine, willing to question established church teaching.
That's a strong critique. Finally, let's loop back briefly to paragraph 35. Here, Pius XII expresses a willingness to actually call some science false science. This really flies in the face of the modern tendency to see science as always neutral, objective, or inevitably self-correcting, doesn't it?
It certainly does. He was implicitly and sometimes explicitly asserting the primacy of divine revelation, especially when it comes to questions of ultimate origins. He demanded that scientific facts, things actually observed and measured, be clearly distinguished from the interpretations or inferences drawn from those facts, especially when those interpretations are based on underlying philosophical principles like strict naturalism.
So when science steps outside its lane.
Exactly. When science ventures into questions of ultimate origins, questions which inherently touch upon theology and metaphysics, it necessarily loses some of its claim to absolute neutrality and authority. Naturalistic science, precisely because of its self-imposed methodological refusal to even consider divine action as a possible explanation, is seen as highly prone to error when it tries to reconstruct unique, unrepeatable historical events like the creation of the universe, life, or humanity.
And the source we're drawing on makes a very strong, maybe even provocative claim about the actual real-world usefulness of these grand, sweeping scientific theories about origin.
It does. The sources contend that the major paradigms like uniformitarian geology, macroevolutionary biology, and even Big Bang cosmology, all of which are heavily focused on reconstructing vast, unobservable, untestable events in the distant past, have not contributed a mite, the source says, to our understanding of the nature of things here and now or to our technological progress.
Really, no contribution to technology.
The argument presented is that genuine technological and scientific progress, the kind that builds bridges, cures diseases, creates computers, comes almost entirely from careful observation, experimentation, and understanding the laws governing the natural world as it operates here and now. It comes from operational science, not from historical or origins science dealing with the deep, inaccessible past. This is a powerful critique, essentially asserting that the Church loses nothing practically or intellectually by adhering firmly to its traditional creation account derived from Genesis.
So the takeaway from this analysis is that the Church would actually gain more credibility, not less, by standing firm on what it holds as the literal historical truth of Genesis 1:11, rather than constantly trying to adjust its timeless theology to fit the shifting sands of scientific hypotheses about the distant past.
That is the uncompromising conclusion derived from this comprehensive, context-aware reading of Humani Generis. The interpretation is that Pius XII intended to erect bulwarks to protect the foundations of truth and reality, seeing compromise on these foundational issues as fundamentally detrimental to both faith and reason.
Well, this has certainly been an intensive and maybe for some, a startling rereading of a critical 20th century document. To try and summarize the core findings of this deep dive based on our sources, Humani Generis is presented not as a liberal license for Catholics to embrace evolution, but as a carefully constructed, deeply conservative series of roadblocks, restrictions, and outright prohibitions.
Yet we established that, according to this view, macroevolution is not presented as a respectable Catholic position, primarily because it fundamentally contradicts the plain, literal, obvious sense of Genesis 1, which Pius XII defended. Furthermore, the two potential ways to reconcile human origins with some form of pre-existing life while maintaining divine creation, natural transformism and special transformism, are either explicitly ruled out by prior magisterial decisions or are seen as deeply philosophically problematic, specifically risking the major theological error of dualism by treating the soul and body as separate substances rather than a unified nature.
And finally, the absolute non-negotiable ban on polygenism, the idea of multiple first parents, which is mandated because of its intimate and unbreakable link with the dogma of original sin, makes any consistent, naturalistic explanation for human origins effectively impossible within a Catholic framework. Because evolution, as understood scientifically, requires populations, not single individuals, to be the locus of change. Pius XII viewed the entire evolutionary framework as suspiciously rooted in philosophical naturalism, a view that ultimately undermines the concept of immutable essences and therefore objective, fixed truth itself.
And zooming out, the encyclical as a whole was really a warning against that larger philosophical system, modernism, which in this interpretation uses the idea of universal evolution to demand the perpetual adaptation and relativization of all truth, ultimately leading, in Pius XII's view, toward moral and theological chaos.
The implications of this detailed, restrictive reading of a 1950 encyclical are pretty staggering for us today, aren't they? The source argues the stakes are enormous. It goes so far as to suggest that much of the prevalent moral decay and maybe the loss of purpose we see in Western civilization can be traced directly back to a false conception of man's fundamental nature.
Which itself is rooted in false conceptions about our origins.
Exactly. And so restoring the traditional theology of creation, based squarely on the literal and historical truth of Genesis 1:11, is posited by the source as a necessary, maybe even the first step toward restoring genuine moral soundness and purpose to our culture.
It makes logical sense within that framework. If man is seen merely as the accidental, transient byproduct of a blind, continuous material process, lacking any fixed, immutable essence given by a creator, then any objective moral laws that would be based on that God-given essence tend to dissolve away. That philosophical linkage Pius XII highlighted evolution leading to nominalism, leading to existentialism, if correct, leads directly to a crisis of meaning and moral authority.
Absolutely. It forces a reconsideration of foundations. So, to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought that arises from these themes. Pius XII, in Humani Generis, explicitly addressed the dangers of what he called Irenism. That's Irenism. It means an imprudent zeal for unity, for peace, for reconciliation that's achieved by softening, downplaying, or compromising on clear dogmatic barriers or truth.
Trying to make peace by blurring the lines.
Right. So if his core concern back in 1950 was avoiding exactly that kind of compromise with philosophical or scientific trends that he saw as actively dangerous to the faith, we have to ask ourselves today, where else in our modern intellectual or cultural landscape might we be tempted toward a similar kind of Irenism? Where might we be subtly compromising what we hold as foundational absolute truth for the sake of achieving cultural harmony, intellectual respectability, or just avoiding conflict? And crucially, what foundational truths might we be inadvertently sacrificing in the process?
That's definitely something worth mulling over, considering how these historical documents and debates continue to shape our present reality.
A powerful lens through which to view many modern intellectual and cultural tensions, for sure.
Indeed. That was the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Ave Maria Stella